Hundreds of thousands of homes and other properties across millions of acres in the U.S. are projected to be at least partially submerged by seawater by 2050, according to a new analysis released, with major implications not just for homeowners but also public services in their communities, as tax bases in hundreds of counties are expected to shrink. The nonprofit research group Climate Central examined the sea level rise that's been projected by experts at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which found earlier this year that sea levels in U.S. coastal areas could rise by about 1 foot by 2050. Tidal boundary lines, and records regarding more than 50 million properties in coastal areas, finding that nearly 650,000 individual properties are most at risk of falling below tidal boundaries within the next 3 decades. Sea level rise is shifting the high and low tide lines that coastal states use to define boundaries between public and private property. As these boundaries shift, private property will be lost to permanent coastal flooding. Louisiana has the most homes and other buildings at risk, with more than 25,000 properties across 2.5 million acres expected to fall below tide level boundaries by 2050. Number 5. Miami. Miami will be 60% underwater by the year 2060, according to researchers. The main culprit, climate change. Scientists at the University of Miami predict the Magic City has a little over 30 years before the water takes over. The seawater is rising at a dramatic rate, so much so insurance companies like Farmers Insurance are quiet quitting the Sunshine State. By 2040, sea levels are expected to be 10 to 17 inches higher than the levels in the year 2000, according to the Unified Sea Level Rise projection for Southeast Florida Regional Climate Compact. Gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide are all to blame for the water rising in the oceans. But Miami-Dade officials are already implementing their sea level rise strategy through adaptation action areas, according to the county's website. The county's plan described adaptation action areas as areas that allow for a more customized and detailed approach to adapting to sea level rise and other resilience. According to the Office of Resilience, Miami's infrastructure improvement strategy includes plans to build higher roads, install pump stations, protect existing buildings with temporary flood panels, and build new infrastructures higher. The sea at the southern end of the Florida Peninsula has risen a foot since the 1900s and almost 5 inches since 1993. The ocean reclaims chunks of land in the fall and spring during so-called sunny day floods, which have become 4 times more common today than 15 years ago. But the impacts of these intensifying climatic changes, which also include the growing threat of monster hurricanes, will not be felt equally. Unlike the jet-set owners of high-end real estate in Miami, the region's middle-class residents, who have most of their savings tied up in their homes, face the prospect of generations of wealth being wiped out when the property market inevitably craters in the face of rising seas. And low-income communities, which during Miami's initial expansion were shunted away from prime waterfront property and often segregated onto the region's high ground, now face a fight to hold on to that elevated land as developers covet property situated away from rising seas. Yet the powers attempting to help the region cope with global warming are barely focused on these inequalities, and that lack of vision could seriously complicate efforts to save South Florida. In fact, mismanaged efforts to adapt could exacerbate a tale of 2 cities, both sinking. Number 4. Atlantic City, New Jersey. Hurricane Sandy ravaged Atlantic City into shocking disarray in 2012, flooding 70% to 80% of the city. Some areas were 8 feet drowned at the heart of the storm, while the lovely boardwalk was left a mess of wooden planks and sand. Citizens waded knee-deep in the aftermath of the once-in-7 100-year storm that was a premonition to the onset of climate change effects. It is projected that Atlantic City will see more frequent and severe storms soon, with a likelihood of drowning by 2100. Sea level has risen more than 18 inches along the New Jersey coastline since the early 1900s, due to a combination of the land sinking and sea levels rising, according to Rutgers University's Climate Change Resource Center. Since 2000, the pace of that increase is speeding up. New Jersey's number of flood days are increasing across the region, according to sea level rise viewer data. For instance, before 1992, Atlantic City had fewer than 5 flood days a year. Between 2016 and 2023, Atlantic City had no fewer than 6 flood days each year, and 6 of those 8 years recorded 10 or more flood days. Multiple factors are causing the rise in water levels. Climate change is warming the ocean temperatures in the Atlantic Ocean, and warmer water is less dense and takes up more volume than colder water. Number 3, New Orleans. Things started to turn in 1895 when 5% of New Orleans was below sea level. By 1935, nearly 30% of the city was below sea level, and today, more than half the city now sits lower than the ocean. The city is truly a deepening bowl surrounded by water. The sinking was caused entirely by humans who thought they were doing a good thing by pumping water out of the city. When water was removed from the swampland, water was not only removed on top of the surface, but also below the surface. This caused air pockets, and the soil at the surface started sinking to fill those air pockets. It became worse when the organic matter that was once in the swamp dried out and decayed, causing even more underground air pockets and in turn sinking. And while swamplands are not being drained as much anymore, the problem continues. The pumps that help New Orleans from filling up with water take sediment out of the ground with the water. Normally, the sediment would continually be replaced by the flooding Mississippi River. However, humans have stopped the sediment deposit process by building dams upriver that trap sediment and by building walls around the river to keep it from flooding and depositing more sediment. What this all means is that parts of New Orleans are still sinking by about 2 inches a year. At the same time, ocean levels are rising due to a warming climate. New Orleans is becoming a deeper and deeper bowl. Incredible modern engineering has created walls to help keep the water out, but in the end, nature will win. Nature always wins. The question is, when will it win? Number 2, Houston. Houston is the 10th fastest sinking city in the world with a rate of 1.95 centimeters per year. Parts of Houston are sinking much faster rate of 2 inches per year. Any kind of underground movement can cause land to sink. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, the subsidence in the Houston area is primarily caused by the pumping of groundwater out of aquifers. As the water is removed, the sediment contained in the aquifer compacts and leaves less space to hold water in the future. This is usually an irreversible process. Researchers found that population growth in the suburbs has led to excessive groundwater extraction in those areas. Similar subsidence issues were found in downtown Houston and suburbs to the southeast of the city in previous years, but groundwater regulation has slowed the sinking of the land. Subsidence in Mont Belvieu appears to be related to the heavy withdrawal of oil and natural gas reserves in that area. Number 1, Boston, Massachusetts. Extreme heat, rain, and snow are already affecting life in this megacity of America. According to a report, while daily changes in sea level might not be immediately noticeable, alterations in flooding patterns are already affecting Boston on the sly. Extreme flooding events are expected to plague the city in the coming years, and groundwater supplies could fall by 18% by 2050. Less snowfall and higher demand for water due to hotter weather would be the culprits responsible for this drop in water levels. To meet the upcoming challenges, the city government has set up the Climate Ready Boston Plan to build a safer future for the city's residents. Only time will tell whether such plans will be able to combat a challenge as monstrous as climate change. If seas rise as projected, it would be devastating to the seaport, putting tens of billions of dollars of new real estate at risk. By the middle of the century, the city will likely see 3,000 properties a year damaged as a result of flooding, costing an estimated $62 million a year,